Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments, and today we are going to talk about culture and disasters towards method and framework. In fact, here we are looking at what is the role of culture in the disaster context, So what I did is I divided this whole study into two lectures, and this is the first part of the lecture, and it is actually my own work, my own doctoral research, master's, so it's almost a decade journey of working in the culturally responsive built environments in disaster context. So this is the first part of the lecture, which talks about how actually I have developed a method and a framework accordingly to understand the role of culture and its relation to the vulnerability. So in fact, I did shown this particular photograph earlier in some time back in one of the lecture, and how I think it was probably in the first lectures, how my journey have started. I'm still bringing back here. In fact, I was a bachelor student and was doing my thesis on Gujarat earthquake housing back in 2002 and 3 sometime, 2002. And that is how I come across the right-hand photograph, which is Latur earthquake recovery, and as well as on the left-hand side we have the geodesic domes. So where actually my journey have started. In fact, I thought this journey was a very short journey, but I never imagined that this has taken me so long, and still I'm in the same paths working on it. And what the reaction I got by looking at this photograph on the right hand side is, this was a photograph from Latur earthquake recovery programs, where many of the houses are still lying empty and they're unoccupied. So the first question which came into my mind was why these technologically well-built constructions were unoccupied by the local inhabitants. So this question, to answer this question, I started looking at working on my thesis on the housing rehabilitation in Kutch in the Gujarat earthquake. So I come across, though there are many concrete structures or permanent structures where the agencies have started giving, and how people are not happy about it and how people are not comfortable in it. So with those gaps, I still had some interest on developing an understanding on the role of culture and what is this vernacular architecture, and that is where I passed through ISVA, which is the International Studies in Vernacular Architecture, and even there with my elective with my subject on natural hazards and environment, I developed an understanding little deeper into it. And then in another 2004, by the time my master's was getting over, before my thesis, I got a chance to work on the thesis on the immediate impact of the disaster. And that is where I was looking at the kind of gap between the community and development groups, and what is this interaction gap. In fact, this is where I worked on the few villages I visited in Kadalur district, Devanapattanam, and in the Nagapattinam districts. So that was a beginning step, and still after that I moved to a kind of villain's role. After my master's, I was working with Benfield Advanced Timber Frame Technologies, where I was engaged in working on prefab timber frame technologies. And there was a project came from United Nations World Tourism Organizations in 2005. There was a Kashmir earthquake, and there was that project is all about sending a few houses, prefab houses, to the Kashmir, the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, or we call it POK, or the others we call it Azad Kashmir, part of it. So where I was designing everything from Britain and shipping these houses to the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and I was not aware of who was the owner and how it was built, neither I don't know what was the site. It was a prefab component manufactured in the factory and packed up like a IKEA furniture and then sent it in the ship, and someone goes there and someone erects it. So this is where some of the questions started coming in mind, because I'm working from the practice side also, and how these gaps could be concealed and how they can be looked into. And this is where I started, the very first understanding which I started was understanding the basic terminology, and that is where the beginning part of my doctoral research at University of Westminster under Tony Lloyd-Jones and Marianne Roberts. And this was the time I'm talking from 2006 to almost like 2010, and at the very beginning I finished my doctorate in 2011 January. So in the beginning stages, I wanted to make clear within myself that what is development. So there have been various definitions I looked across, from starting from Amartya Sen, development as freedom, where he talks about the ability that one or individual or a society or a community, how they are able to access their resources and how they manage to survive. So in my context, when I'm looking at disasters, I looked at development in three phases. One is the usual development processes, which is even before the disaster, the municipalities or the counties or the local panchayats, how they are involved in the development process, and just the immediate impact of a disaster, how the relief or the rescue operations, that is also supported by various international NGOs and the national NGOs. And that is also one set of development. And the third one is with a little long term after the disaster, following a disaster, which is a post-disaster development process. So what you can see here is a traditional house. And you can see a post-disaster reconstructed. So here what I'm looking at it's not just only the dwelling units, but I'm also looking at who are the actors involved in it. Here the local municipalities, the local communities are involved, the local stakeholders. Here the international NGOs. But here is a long-term project of settlement and the adaptation process, where part of NGO culture or the non-government organizations, and there is a little interface between the local and the non-local. So then I started looking at understanding the basic concepts of what is the relationship between the disasters, development, and vulnerability, and that is where I come across a lot of literature. In fact, one person which I should thank is Rohit Jigyasu's work on his work to and Nepal and even Gujarat. So where he talks about the reducing vulnerability through the local knowledge. And here what he talks is, so he brings some of the models of these development and disaster and vulnerability. So ideally, if a disaster, if the development is followed after a disaster, which was a traditional model before Melalatu, the disaster happens, the development follows upon it. Ideally, the vulnerability should be less. The factor that in reality our issue is the disaster component response within the development. We have the existing component, that is where the vulnerability component is more, and that is where we call is R is equal to vulnerability plus hazard. So this is a very simple equation. In fact, it is not the hazard which is killing people, it is not the hazard which is taking out the lives and livelihoods and the property. Like if a cyclone comes, yes, it just comes and goes. Even earthquake comes, it comes and goes. But what is the susceptible part of it is how you are prone to it. Now, the same 9 Richter scale will come in Japan, the same 8 Richter scale will come in California, but still why you don't see that kind of losses? Here, how you can see in the countries like India or Indonesia or even Ghana, how you can see a more number of losses, especially because that is how we are susceptible and prone to those hazards. Though they are also prone, but their capacities are different. They develop their capacities, and that is what we are talking about, the relationship between disasters and development and vulnerability. One of the important person we have to bring is Frederick Cunning, who actually brings a relation between disasters and development. So, in fact, till that point, development was disasters. They are seen till 1980s. They are seen as the two independent futures, phenomena. But then, Cunning actually brings a relationship between the disasters and the development, and even professors like Ian Davis, who actually talks about shelter after disasters and how disasters as a catalyst of change, how it can be as an agents of change, both in a positive and the negative ways of it. Whereas Lewis, he talks about it is not just a cycle, it is a bicycle. But what he actually compares is he puts the development which takes in the forward phase, but ideally if you're riding a bicycle, it should move in this way, but not really. It may move in this direction as well. So, because they both are not driven by the same force. So here one has to look at it. It's not the development always taking the vulnerability forward, but it's also the different forces bringing this vulnerability in a different direction. That is one phase he talks is from the concept of moving of a cycle, disaster cycle, to a disaster bicycle. Now I started working on the vulnerabilities. So the way I have started describing on the pre-disaster development and the post-disaster development, and that is where you can see even in these photographs in the villages which I have visited, the pre-disaster, they have problems of water supply, they have problems of sanitation, they have problems of various local disputes, the land tenure issues. So we already have these vulnerable situations, and disaster adds to it. So with what we are having and how the disaster adds to it, because the loss of heritage and loss of our infrastructure. So because it is not just we can't see what has been lost, but what is made them to lose and what is still, what are the pre-disaster situations. And now I will again show you the same photograph which I showed you earlier on a same village, where the post-disaster vulnerability, even after 2 years, still there were water issues and still people are. So what these photographs are telling is a span of 2 to 3 years. A span of 2 to 3 years, it is saying that yes, their vulnerability is directly proportional with the kind of development, and how actually development overlooks the pre-disaster conditions. Now I started understanding that in what way I can understand vulnerability. So I looked at various aspects of how one can understand the vulnerability. One is the technocentric analysis, which talks about the physical vulnerability of buildings through technical inspection of faults, weaknesses, and basically civil engineers or the structural engineers or surveyors do come and understand the site, how it has failed, where it has failed. And later from 1980s onwards, there's an awareness on the target group analysis, because every disaster happens. It is not every time it's the same groups who are getting, having an impact. So now they are focusing on this target group. That is where the sociologists started looking at it. A target group. Who are these target group and why they are targeted? How they are targeted? So, and that is where it talks about the social vulnerability. And the third one is a situational analysis. It is not just in like what kind of a group or a person or a family belongs to, but it is the nature of their daily life and their actual situation, how it was and how it is and how it is changing. So we are talking about a situation, because sometimes a person might be poor before disaster, or he might have become rich, or he might have become a wealthy person became poor, because of his loss of family. And so basically there's a tremendous change in the whole process, and that is where one have to understand the situation. And the last model, we could talk about the community-based analysis, which is more of a kind of PRA techniques where we talk about how NGOs work together to make awareness within the community, realize their problems, and show them a direction how to build it. I'll tell you a good example of a Bollywood movie of Swadesh, where Shah Rukh Khan, at the end of he goes to a village, a NASA scientist. He goes to a village and he helps all the villagers. There was no electricity in that village. At the end, he only makes a small bulb and he brings electricity. But the whole process is all about how he makes the villagers realize their own indigenous issues. How he puts together, it's not just throwing money and constructing electricity platforms for them, but how he actually puts the villagers in confidence and how he brings them and how he uplifts them so that they can help themselves in dealing with their own issues. So that is where the community. But in this my research, because being a single person and handling it, understanding the change, especially the culture, when we are talking about how this transformation, the pre-disaster to post-disaster context, how it is changing, how the response situation. So that is where I looked at the situational analysis. And so there are other models which I can just give you a brief on this. The pressure and release model, which is of Blakey and Terry Cannon and Davis, where they talked about this pressure and release model. So here also it says about how a progression of vulnerability. You have the root causes, which you have the existing, like for instance, there are certain tribes or certain villages who have a very limited access to power structures and resources. And also the ideologies, like in the Arab countries, they have a different ideology of gender. They have some power, limited power to the gender. Many of the people who died in tsunami from the fishermen communities, many of them are women, and because women doesn't know how to swim. Whereas in the Western cultures, at least, because if many of the women are familiar with the swimming, maybe they might have rescued themselves. So obviously, these are some of the root causes. Added to that, there is some kind of dynamic pressures, which talks about how their lack of local institutions, local training, and the local markets, how the change in the market trends and rapid urbanization. So these are all some everyday add-on things which adds more pressure to it. And ideally, this whole process leads to unsafe conditions. That is where people living squatter settlements, people living in an unsafe locations, and lack of local institution supports, and so this is the whole thing. That is where we talk about the R is equal to H plus V. So this is a model which we talk about. And coming to the sustainable livelihoods model, where it's an asset framework. DFID have developed this, and later Tony Lloyd-Jones and Carol Raccotti have also worked on a kind of basis. In fact, the original model was developed by DFID in 1997 sometime, and later how it was modified is because it is how the livelihood assets, how people manage their assets, and how people cope up with how they can access the resources. So that is where they're linked with the vulnerability component and how the policies and institutions relate to it and how they derive to the infrastructure and services, and at the same time the livelihood opportunities. So this is a whole framework which we call it as a sustainable livelihoods framework. And but what is here missing is it is not just an economic necessity one looks at it or how one act upon. It is also about the cultural dimension or the cultural factors where people manage their assets and make their livelihood choices to act upon. Now, this is how I come to a point where because there are a lot of literature working on the relationship between culture and built environment. I think in our previous many lectures have discussed about it. And there is also about a lot of literature on culture and vulnerability, and there's also a lot of literature on vulnerability and development. But how I am looking, because a sociologist can look this in a very different approach, an anthropologist can look at this component in a different approach. So I am looking, being an architect, I'm looking from a built environment perspective. And not only built environment perspective, I am looking in a disaster context more specifically. So this is how I started looking at various work on Bourdieu's cultural capital and Kim Dovey's and the Leach work and the Regina Lim's work. So this whole discussion what we talked about habitus, cultural capital in my earlier lectures, these all have been read through and been analyzed to formulate my understanding on how I can go ahead with understanding the culture. So in one of the model which I come across, especially from a built environment perspective, is Regina Lim's model, and this is where she worked on, she coins a term called cultural environment. It is a matrix. She defines this environment as a matrix of various dimensions of religion, belief system, the ecological environment, economy, and the family structure, kinship, gender roles, politics, cultural interaction. So all this becomes a kind of matrix, and how this becomes a structures that create a cultural identity. And this whole set, she formulates it as she coins it as a cultural environment. Then to give a little brief about Bourdieu's theory, where in 1986 in his book on forms of capital, where he talks about three forms of capital. One is the inherited, the embodied, and the second one is an objectified, and the third one is an institutional. So from an educational perspective, this particular theories has been developed. And inherited, how you learn from your parents and how your society, the kind of language you develop, the kind of habitual practices which you develop. And similarly, objectifies, how you portrays your objects, how you sculpts your being, that possesses an identity. Like a fisherman boat in China and fisherman boat in Kerala and the fisherman boat in Bengal, all of them are doing fishing, but their boats are different. The houses are different, because that is how the representation comes into how they objectify through art and architecture. And institutional, obviously it was being much debated, because he talks about this, the popular culture as well. So, and then I think in our previous lectures we did discuss about criticism on Bourdieu's theory. And from the built environment perspective, where Neil Leach talks about identification of a space in three dimensions. One is the narrativism, performatives, and mirroring. How we talk about spaces, how we narrate the spaces. Is it a footpath? Is it a market? So obviously there's the narrations talk about, in fact in our lecture series of power series of that, we talked about all the narrations where Dovey also narrates the Chinese Tiananmen Square and the Nazi's ideologies, how they have placed. Similarly on the performatives, where certain activities are performed and certain rituals are taken place, so there is an action taken place and how it is remembered. And similar actions are repeated by a course of time, and that is how one will develop an attachment to it. So that is where the mirroring comes up. So this is on the discussion on the culture, but whereas to cut short it, I would now bring to there was always a dialogue of how in a disaster situation, how we can bring back to the same situation. Now, whether we need to bring back to the same situation or we need to build back better. So in fact, that is where the arguments of globalization, because now people cannot, Deborah Lupton talks about, now people cannot simply rely on local knowledges, tradition and religious percepts, habit or observation of other processes to conduct their everyday lives, as they did in pre-modern or early modern times. So there is always a conflict between tradition and there's a tension between the tradition and the modern, because obviously each influences each other. There's a little contest between these subjects. And that's how I started defining of how we can define the culture. Culture is defined as a sum of total experiences and accumulated indigenous knowledge within the space that communities rely on, and giving meanings to their lives and places they live in, through which people habitually develop an approach to survive their everyday life, whether it is a pre-disaster situation or a post-disaster response situation. So this is how here I brought some kind of experiences and how it transforms through their habitual practices. Now, again, here the main argument of the study talks about is the cultural dimensions of local communities are not effectively and sufficiently addressed in the current post-disaster humanitarian and development processes, but to the disadvantage of both the communities affected and the humanitarian development agencies helping them. So here I am bringing the component of, because why we have to address, why the culture, when the culture is overlooked in the process, it is not only a disadvantage to the communities, but it is also a disadvantage to the NGOs or the humanitarian agencies working on those projects. How much investment do you think about the Latur earthquake has been spent, and what happens to those investment if some development is not compatible with the local cultures? So that's how I started looking at how to understand the role of culture in the post-disaster recovery process and its relation to the vulnerability. Here, it was important for me to address with culture. It's not just only the role of culture in the post-disaster recovery process, but what is its relation, how it can reduce or increase the vulnerable situation, in particular to the built environment of affected traditional settlements. So now, after looking at various theoretical discussions and various analysis of deriving certain methods, I looked at two components. One is the cultural anthropology, and the second one is the morphology, which talks about the change. And these two fields of inquiry have been taken into consideration to understand the role of diversified cultures in the disasters and development setup. And then this is where I started looking at various literature and how I can actually set a benchmark of whether this space has achieved a better environment or not. And that is where one of the good old theories of responsive environments developed by Ian Bentley from Joint Center for Urban Design, the responsive environments, where he talks about certain principles: permeability, legibility, variety, visual appropriateness, and richness, and these all forms a set of responsiveness of a place. And that is how I named this course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Now I developed a kind of framework. What I did was I first divided this whole built environment into a kind of funnel type, where we have an ecological environment and we have a geographical landscape, and then the humans intervene, and then they set up with a kind of public space structures, plots, buildings. So this is the built environment component. So you have the built environment component, and on one side you have the pre-disaster influences on it and the post-disaster influences of it. But another side of it is the culture component, the structures which create an identity. So taking from the LIMS model, so I started working on this, how this shapes the built environment. Then the Bentley's work of responsive environments. So how these dimensions, how these indices can actually check whether space, how this is shaping this place, and how it is qualifying this place. And in both the context, this is how I developed a framework. It took me a long time to come with this kind of framework. And then I traveled across to how many case studies I should select. Then I traveled across the Tamil Nadu, the coast of Tamil Nadu, visited many villages, 17 villages I have visited. And then I've taken a criteria of some which are least affected, average affected, and the most affected, and then taken by NGOs, taken by in situ, taken by relocation context. So all this criteria has been laid out. And the one good thing what I can see is here, when I was traveling down south from here to here, I can see that most of the Hindu population I found here, and most of the Roman Catholic I found here, and most of the mixed variety I found here. So I was wondering, the social landscape is a little different, because most of the fishermen here are the Roman Catholic, and on the northern side more of the Hindu, and here I can see the Muslim and near Karaikal and Nagapattinam, and the mixed population. So then I started looking at the geographical aspects. I can see that the Coromandel coast, which has the shallow waters, and the Gulf of Mannar, which have a deep waters. So here you can see that the shallow waters indicate less fish, and deep waters indicate more fish. The more fish, more money. Less fish, less money. So obviously it has an impact on the kind of nature of built environments. So not only that, I have also taken another criteria of, so one is the land is different, the second is the sea is different, the third is the communities are different. The fourth one is development input is different. Here I have selected a Dalit village where the government is taking care of the reconstruction. Here an fisherman NGO is taking care of the Tarangambadi, and in here it is the local church. So basically the three sets of development inputs, how they are relating, and three different cultural geographic key component I have taken as a criteria to select my case studies. And then because of being study on culture, I looked at the kind of qualitative approaches where I have adopted the field work through direct, indirect participation, documentation and recording, interviews and the mapping exercises. Initially I adopted the questionnaires as well, but then I thought it was not possible to investigate the culture in that manner, so I have taken it out, and these are some of the methods which I used, and these methods which I will be discussing again later in my next lecture, the following lecture, where this whole I've conducted a kind of anthropological understanding. I lived there as a fisherman and I explain all these things. And here what happened is, in the coastal regulation zone, many of the houses following a coastal regulation zone, the villages have been relocated to some other place because they should not construct anything beyond this 500 meters from the high tide line. And so we'll continue with the next following up lecture, especially with the case studies. And this is all developed from my own work, and thank you very much.